Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. Today, I'm excited to present tracing Tennyson's stylistic shifts, stylometric insights from early lyrics to late epics. We all know Alfred Lord Tennyson as the voice of the Victorian age, a poet whose career spanned over 6 decades. Literary critics have long debated the evolution of his style. But what if we could measure this evolution? What if we could use computational methods to track the precise changes in its language, sentence structure, and vocabulary? And this is the core question of my research. Using a digital humanities approach called Stylometry, I will analyze Tennyson's poetry not just as art, but as data. My primary goal is essentially twofold. First, I want to answer the what. Does Tennyson's poetic style exhibit statistically significant changes across his career? To investigate this, I've categorized his work into 3 distinct periods: early, middle, and late. Second, I want to answer the why. If we define quantitative changes, what is their nature and what caused them? And this is where we move from data to interpretation, placing these shifts within the rich literary historical context. As the slide indicates, my methodology is hybrid. I am combining quantitative stylometric techniques with qualitative literary interpretation. The study I'm presenting today is research in progress. It is an active and ongoing investigation, not a fully concluded project. Therefore, the findings I will be sharing are preliminary, but they are already revealing fascinating patterns that I'm excited to discuss with you. As I mentioned, I have divided his long career into 3 phases. First, the early period, covering the 1830s and 40s. And this corpus includes his celebrated lyrical poems like The Lady of Shalott, Mariana, and Ulysses. These are the works most defined by their rich romantic imagery and psychological introspection. Second, the middle period, which I have focused on the 1850s. This period is unique as it consists of a single monumental text, In Memoriam AHH. The reason for treating it as a standalone period is that it was composed over 17 years. It therefore functions as a microcosm in itself, a personal and stylistic journey captured in a single volume. Finally, the late period covers the 1860s through the 1880s. This is represented by his massive epic cycle, Ideals of the King. This work represents the culmination of his mortal style and his role as a public poet laureate, engaging with grand national and moral themes. So now to analyze the collective style of each era as noted at the top of the slide, I consolidated the texts from each period into 3 main files. Okay, so the next question is how to measure the stylistic differences between these 3 periods. First, to get a high-level visual understanding of the relationships between the 3 periods, I am using Stylo for R. This is a widely used package within the R programming environment. And it is a standard tool in the field of digital humanities for stylometry. It's powerful because it can statistically analyze text based on word frequencies and other features. Using Stylo, I will perform 2 key analyses. First, a cluster analysis. Second, I will conduct a principal components analysis, or PCA. The first result, which comes from the cluster analysis, this method creates a family tree or dendrogram for my texts. To do this, I first broke down the 3 corpus files into smaller, equal-sized segments. In this case, each leaf on the tree, each label, represents a 3,000-word chunk. The analysis then measures the stylistic similarity between all of these chunks. The specific fingerprint used here is the frequency of the 100 most frequent words, or MFW. And the distance metric is Euclidean distance. Now let's look at what this tree tells us. The analysis clearly separates separates the text chunks into two massive, distinct branches. The bottom branch in green consists entirely of chunks from the late period. The top branch contains almost all the chunks from the early period in red and the middle period in blue. And this is a clear finding. The style of Tennyson's late work is dramatically and consistently different from everything that came before it. But what about the middle period? If you look closely at the top branch, the middle chunks are nested within the early cluster. And this visually confirms that in memoriam, still shares a stylistic DNA with his early work. Okay, so different parameters, but a similar pattern. And I ran the analysis one more time, again adjusting the parameters. And as you can see, the upper structure is remarkably stable. We see the exact same primary split with the late period forming its own supercluster, separate from the early and middle periods. But the most interesting part of this analysis is the middle period. If you look at the blue labels, you see that all of the middle chunks are now grouped together in one single cluster. And this analysis shows them as a cohesive stylistic unit. To further test the reliability of these clusters, I performed the bootstrap consensus tree analysis. And you can see a deep fundamental split in the data. On one side, all the late period chunks branch up together, forming a separate and unified cluster. On the other side, we find all the early and middle period chunks. And crucially, within that early and middle branch, the middle texts once again form their own subcluster. And this confirms that they are stylistically similar to the early works, but also distinguishable from them. And this is principal components analysis, or PCA. Or PCA takes the complex high-dimensional data and reduces them down to a simple 2D chart. The two axes, PC1 and PC2, represent the two strongest dimensions of stylistic variation. The result provides a powerful confirmation of the cluster analysis. So notice how this PC1 axis creates an almost perfect division. To the right of the central dotted line, we have a large dense cluster of all the late period chunks. To the left of the line, we find all of the early and middle chunks. And what about the middle period? You can see they are positioned firmly in the same territory as the early texts. They are not up in their own separate space. And this visually confirms that in memoriam, it is stylistically very close to the early works, even as it forms its own cluster within that larger group. Okay, so similar results. Okay, now let me briefly summarize the key conclusions drawn from all the style results we have just seen. First, there is a clear, major, statistically significant stylistic break in Tennyson's career. The late period on one side and the early and middle periods on the other. Second, the middle period in memoriam has a dual identity. It is stylistically closer to his early works. However, it is not identical. The middle period chunks form their own subcluster, proving it has a unique and highly consistent stylistic signature of its own. Okay, so now the stylistic analysis has given me the macro perspective. Now, I need to move to micro perspective. For this deeper, more granular analysis, I am using Python. As the slide states, I selected Python because it has an incredibly robust ecosystem for natural language processing, or NLP. And using Python, I'm conducting a suite of specific analysis, and this slide outlines my roadmap. And this analysis will, together, help me build a complete picture of how Tennyson's style evolved. Yeah, this slide shows the crucial first step of setting up the analysis environment. The code you see on the left is the first cell from my Jupyter notebook, which imports all the necessary tools. My primary tool for the deep linguistic analysis is the Spacey library. I chose Spacey because it's a modern, state-of-the-art NLP library that is fast and efficient at parsing text. It's particularly powerful for the syntactic complexity analysis I mentioned earlier. And as you see in step 3, I am not using a simple, small statistical model. Instead, I've specifically installed ENCO Web TLF. This is a powerful English transformer model. And by using this, Spacey can understand words in their context, which provides far more accurate and linguistically rich annotations for everything from part of speech tagging to sentence structure. And this superior accuracy is fundamental to the entire Python portion of my study. And this is the foundational data, the total number of sentences and tokens that Spacey identified in each period. A token here refers to an individual word or punctuation mark. This table confirms the significant difference in text length between the corpora. And this difference is precisely why normalization is critical for all my upcoming frequency analysis. So using the sentence and token data parsed by the speech transformer model, I can now present my first set of findings on syntactic complexity. This table shows 4 key metrics I calculated to understand the structure of Tennyson's writing. The definitions are on the slide. Mean and median sentence length are straightforward. The average length and the middle value length of a sentence. A subordinate per sentence is a crucial direct measure of grammatical complexity. It counts how often he uses dependent clauses. And finally, MDD, mean dependency distance. This is a more sophisticated computational metric. It measures, on average, how spread out or nested a sentence's grammar is. A higher MDD score suggests more complex phrasal structures. Okay, this slide provides a visual representation of the mean sentence length data we just saw in the table. As the bar chart shows, there is a clear and progressive increase in the average number of tokens per sentence as Tennyson's career progresses. And as the text on the right explains, in literary stylistics, this isn't just about length. It's a strong indicator of greater syntactic elaboration, more complex narrative structures, and the kind of Victorian-style periodic phrasing that we associate with grand subjects. If mean sentence length told us his sentences are getting longer, this metric, subordinate per sentence, tells us they are getting more complex. The bar chart itself shows a clear trend. The list style of Ideals of the King is not just defined by long sentences, but by sentences that are grammatically more intricate and layered. In short, it's a direct measure of syntactic depth and what linguists call a hypertactic style. A style where ideas are hierarchically nested within a sentence, which is typical of formal Victorian prose and poetry. Okay, this chart shows the mean dependence distance. This is perhaps the most sophisticated metric for complexity. It doesn't just count what is in a sentence, but how the sentence is arranged. In simple terms, a high MDD means that grammatically related words, like a subject and its verb, are often separated from each other by other words or clauses. And this spreading out of grammar is a hallmark of highly complex, nested sentence structures. Now, the data on this chart does not show the same simple linear increase as the other metrics. The middle period in memoriam shows a slight dip to 2.77. And it suggests that even though the sentences in memoriam are longer and have more subordinate clauses, their internal structure might actually be more regular or orderly. This might be due to the poem's very strict and uniform stanzaic form, which could channel the syntax into more predictable patterns. In the late period, the MDD lives to 3.31, by far the highest of the three. The style of Iris of the King is definitely the most complex. He is not only writing longer sentences with more clauses, but he is also arranging those clauses in more intricate, spread out ways, which is characteristic of the grand epic style he was aiming for. Okay, I'm going to skip this. And all right, so I have looked at the structure of his sentences. My next set of analysis focuses on his vocabulary, specifically his lexical diversity. This slide defines the key metrics I used. Tokens is simple, the total number of alphabetic words in the text. Types is the count of unique words. Now, the most basic measure of diversity is the TTR, type token ratio, which is just the number of types divided by tokens. However, TTR is deeply flawed when comparing texts of different length. A longer text naturally has a lower TTR. To get a reliable comparison, I must use more sophisticated length-independent metrics. I've used two. First, MATTR, which stands for Moving Average Type Token Ratio. And this method solves the length problem by chopping the entire text into small, equal-sized windows, in this case, 5-word chunks, calculating the TTR for each chunk, and then taking the average of all those scores. Second, MTLD, or Measure of Textual Lexical Diversity. And this is a very robust modern metric. In simple terms, it scans the text and measures, on average, how many words it takes for the vocabulary diversity to fall below a specific threshold, which is 0.72. For both MATTR and MTLD, a higher score means greater lexical richness and diversity. Okay, so this slide visualizes the data from the previous slide, which makes the trends much easier to see. A key discovery is that Tennyson's great middle period poem, In Memoriam, represents the peak of his lexical creativity. The metrics show that the late period was written with a slightly less diverse vocabulary than his middle period work. Okay, now, the MATTR and MTLD values I just showed you were single average scores for each period. A single number, however, doesn't tell us the whole story. It doesn't show us the variance or the uncertainty of this measure. So, to get a more reliable and statistically robust comparison, I've applied a bootstrapping method. Bootstrapping lets me move from a single point estimate to a full sampling distribution. This is a much more powerful way to visualize the uncertainty and robustly compare the periods. Let's look at this first bootstrap chart, which analyzes TTR. As noted at the top, I did not just calculate one TTR for each massive text. Instead, I took many random 5,000 token samples from each of the three periods, and then I calculated the TTR for each of those equal-sized chunks. Okay, I applied the same bootstrapping method to MATTR, and this final box plot shows the bootstrap results for MTLD, which is arguably the most sophisticated and reliable metric for lexical diversity. And as the points on the right explain, MTLD doesn't just average the diversity, it measures the dynamism of the vocabulary, how long on average it takes for the text to become repetitive and for the TTR to drop below a set threshold. Therefore, a higher MTLD score means greater, more sustained lexical variety. 10분 남았는데요. 제가 이거 저도 동시에 이거 지금 켰거든요. Okay, there are two conclusions I draw from the three box plots for TTR, MATTR, and MTLD. First, in memoriam, represents the peak of Tennyson's lexical richness and vocabulary dynamism. The second conclusion shows why using multiple metrics is so crucial. If you look at the TTR and MATTR plots, they both suggest that the late period has the lowest local diversity, and this indicates a style that is more repetitive. However, when you look at the MTLD plot, we see a different story. Here, the late period is more lexically sophisticated than the early period. This is not a contradiction. It's a key insight. The late style is structurally more repetitive, but globally more sophisticated than his early work. Yeah. So in the previous slides, the box plots visually suggested that the lexical diversity scores were different across the three periods. But in quantitative research, a visual observation is not enough. So I needed to determine if these differences were statistically significant or if they could have been the result of a random chance. To do this, I performed the Ku-Kadh age test. I chose this specific test because it is the correct non-parametric method for comparing the distributions of three or more independent groups without assuming the data is normally distributed. This table shows the results, and I want to draw your attention to two key columns. First, and most importantly, is the p-value. This tells us the probability that the observed differences are a fluke. And the standard threshold for significance in science is usually 0.05. As you can see, the p-values for all three of my metrics are infinitesimally small. And this means I can confidently reject the null hypothesis. The differences in lexical diversity that we saw in the box plots are real and statistically significant. Second, the p-value tells me the difference is real, but it doesn't tell me if it's big. For that, I will look at the epsilon squared, which measures the effect size or the magnitude of the difference. As the slide notes, both TTR and MATTR show large effects, and MTLD, our most sophisticated metric, shows a solid medium effect. So the Ku-Kadh test gave me a single global answer. Yes, there is a statistically significant difference somewhere among the three periods, but that's not specific enough. It doesn't tell me which periods are different from each other. To answer this, I perform a Dunn's post hoc test. This is the standard follow-up test. It performs a pairwise comparison for every possible combination. Early versus middle versus late, and early versus late, to pinpoint exactly where the significant differences lie. This table shows the p-values for those comparisons, specifically for MTLD. And let's read the results. First, look at early versus middle. The p-value is far, far below the 0.05 threshold. This means the middle period is statistically significantly different from the early period. The middle period is also statistically significantly different from the late period. But now, the most interesting part is early versus late. The p-value here is 1. This means there is no statistically significant difference between the early and late periods in terms of the lexical diversity as measured by MTLD. And this is a crucial discovery. Tennyson's middle period is a strong stylistic deviation in terms of vocabulary dynamism. His early and late styles are, statistically speaking, similar. while his middle period stands alone. Okay, now I move to the frequency of archaism. First, as the slide explains, I used an archaic lexicon, which is a predefined list of archaic words. Second, I specifically sorted for words with the historical verb suffixes ETH and EST, as these are strong markers of an antiquated style. The crucial column in this table is per 10K. This shows the normalized frequency of all archaic forms per 10,000 tokens. And this bar chart visualizes the normalized data from the previous table. And this per 10K metric is the only way to get a fair comparison, as it adjusts for the different length of the corpora. A higher bar means a higher density of archaic language. And what we see is a clear progressive increase in the use of archaisms across Tennyson's career. The late period jumps to the peak of over 300. And this is Idylls of the King. So to write an epic poem about the medieval world of King Arthur, Tennyson made a conscious and deliberate stylistic choice to adopt an archaizing style. Now I'm introducing another very different type of analysis. This is the Jensen-Shannon distance, or JSD. And what is this and what am I measuring? JSD, as I'm using it here, allows me to zoom in on a very specific subconscious layer of style, the distribution of function words. And these are the non-lexical grammatical glue of the language. An author's preference for these words is often a deep unconscious habit. Now let's look at the results in the table. First, as the slide notes, all the values are relatively low. It confirms that we are dealing with a single author. At this fundamental grammatical level, Tennyson's authorial fingerprint remains consistent across his career. However, the trend of these values is the real story. Notice that the distance is increasing. It shows a progressive stylistic drift. His fundamental grammatical structure or syntactic rhythm is evolving. And it confirms that the most marked evolution in this deep structure happens after the middle period. Okay, so far we have explored the structural changes in Tennyson's style, sentence length, lexical diversity, and the frequency of archaisms. Now I want to dig deeper into the thematic content. What specific words are most characteristic of each period? To do this, I performed a log likelihood ratio k-needs analysis. This is a powerful statistical test that identifies diagnostic words. It finds which words are statistically overrepresented in one corpus when compared to another. And this slide shows the output, the top 15 keywords that are most uniquely characteristic of each period, along with their anti-keywords. The next slide summarizes the meaning of those results. This LLR analysis allows me to trace Tennyson's stylistic trajectory, not just as a set of abstract numbers, but as a concrete thematic evolution. Okay, following the thematic analysis from the LLR, I wanted to see if these stylistic shifts were also reflected at a deep grammatical level. To do this, I calculated the proportional distribution of major parts of speech, or POS, for each period. The land graph shows the proportion of adjectives, adverbs, nouns, proper nouns, and verbs. The results paint a picture of its stylistic progression, and it aligns with my other findings. And my final analysis moves from sentence structure and vocabulary to the emotional layer of the text. I wanted to see if I could track the dominant sentiment or emotional trajectory of Tennyson's poetry across his career. To do this, I used two different tools as they are built differently and capture different things. Vader, which is a balance-based dictionary specifically optimized for short texts. A text block, which is a general-purpose analyzer that provides two key scores, clarity and subjectivity. The table shows the average scores for each period. For me, the most fascinating finding on this slide comes from a text block's subjectivity score in the orange table. So look at the TB subjectivity values. The early and late periods are both more subjective, but the middle period, in memoriam, has the lowest score. This is an insight. This score means that in memoriam, his great poem of grief, his great elegy, is ironically the most objective and least opinionated of his works. Okay, another emotion analysis using the NRC emotion lexicon. A crucial conclusion from this is that Tennyson's stylistic evolution seems to have occurred within the same core emotional framework. In other words, while the linguistic architecture of his poetry was rebuilt over his career, the fundamental emotional tone of his voice remained steady. Okay, so this brings me to the end of my analysis, and thank you very much for your time and attention.